My name is Dixie, and I grew up in a small town in northwest Louisiana. My family was among the haves in the midst of a lot of have-nots. This story reminds me of the tuna stories that you may have seen at the Paramount Theater downtown, because my hometown was very familiar with that, was very similar, especially with names and accents, etc. The day after my mother and I came home from the hospital after my birth, Pearlie Mae Brown came to work for us. I hope I can do this. She was a housekeeper, but in those days she was called a maid, the help. Pearlie Mae was a large black woman, and she had big scarred hands. They were scarred from years of work. She had picked cotton on the day that I was born. Her fingers were gnarled, and I think now it was from arthritis, but she was a wonderful caretaker, and she ironed and did everything she was supposed to do. She was a good person in a time that I knew I didn't like, but I couldn't really understand why. She wore starched white uniforms and was very quiet around my parents unless they spoke to her first. I always rode in the back seat with her when my mother would take her home at the end of the day. My interaction and my trust in Pearlie Mae grew as I grew older, and I remember distinctly her being in the laundry room, ironing and singing gospel songs. And I would go and sit on the freezer, dirty and barefoot, and we would just talk. And she would tell me stories, and one of the most fascinating was a story about giant snakes that were in the cotton fields. And if you took your hoe and cut them apart, they would come back together and they would come after you. And I was just, So I'm telling my family, my brother and my parents, this story that evening, and my father said, "Well, darling, she was saying joining snakes, and you know those don't really exist." And I was like, okay, but I never told Pearlie Mae that because I wanted to think like she did. So I still think of giant snakes, and I think there may be, who knows. My parents would go away for weekends on occasion and leave Pearlie Mae to take care of my brother and I. She would sleep on a cot in the laundry room, and we had a beautiful guest room right down the hall from us. And I asked her about that one day, and she said, "I don't need that, child. I just need a place to rest." Aww. It occurred to me later that she never expected to stay in the guest room. But I taught her to play some board games where you didn't have to read, and she let me stay up late and gave me snacks, and she would pat my back when I was afraid of the dark. She took me to a movie matinee one day in the one theater in our little town, and I was surprised when we walked up some creaky old wooden steps. And then we were in the balcony that I didn't even know existed. I don't remember what the story was, what the movie was, but I thought it was a great adventure. And when it was over, I realized I was the only one who was different in that room. We walked home from the movie that day, and I remember, if you remember the beginning of Andy Griffith's shows, yes. I was running and playing and picking up rocks and throwing them. And Pearlie Mae, as always, was taking care of me and doing the responsible thing that she always did. I was in the 7th grade and came home from school one day, and my mother told me that Pearlie Mae had died. Man. Nobody really knew what had happened, but my best friend and my mother and I went to her funeral in an old country church out in the country. I don't remember anything about the service. But I remember afterward, a very old woman came up to my mother and my friend and I, and she looked at us girls, and she looked at my mother, and she said, "Which one is the one she raised?" I knew I was going to cry at that one. I got even more insight into Pearlie Mae that day. And I'll never forget all the things that she left for me that are still in my heart and in my mind. And I never knew very much about her family, but I appreciate your letting me share her with you today.